Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're taking a closer look at something called NGO-DARPAN.
NGO-DARPAN.
Yeah, it's a system in India for registering NGOs.
Okay.
Might not sound thrilling at first, but trust me, this deep dive could be pretty eye-opening, even if you're not directly, involved with NGOs in India. This is about kind of understanding these bigger trends.
Right.
Government transparency, accountability in the social sector. Plus, it's a cool case study for anyone interested in international funding.
Right.
All the compliance stuff that comes with that.
I think what's really interesting about what India is doing with this is it's not just about regulating NGOs. They're actually trying to support and empower them through this platform.
So rather than just telling us what it is, can you maybe give us the WHY?
Okay.
Why did the Indian government create NGO-DARPAN in the first place?
So think of it as a bridge between the government and the whole NGO sector.
Yeah.
Before DARPAN, there wasn't really any central database, So it was difficult to keep track of NGOs, understand their activities,
Right.
even just know how many were actually operating.
Yeah.
This made it really tough to distribute funding effectively, or even just ensure compliance with regulations.
Right.
DARPAN was created to kind of fix those challenges and just create a system that was more transparent and accountable.
So how does that transparency, how does that actually work in practice?
Imagine you're a donor. You want to support NGOs in India.
Right.
Before DARPAN, you'd have to rely on word of mouth, limited info,
Yeah.
potentially risky field visits even.
Yeah.
Now you can just go to the DARPAN website,
Wow.
see a list of all these registered NGOs, their financials, the projects, their impact reports. It's all out in the open.
That makes a lot of sense from a donor's perspective.
Yeah.
But what about the NGOs themselves? What's their incentive to go through this whole registration process? I mean, I imagine there's got to be some bureaucracy involved.
Oh, there is. You're right. There's paperwork involved.
Yeah.
But the benefits, they outweigh the hassle.
Okay.
For one thing, DARPAN registration is mandatory for NGOs that want to receive government funding or participate in any government schemes.
Right.
Essentially, it's like a requirement to be considered a legitimate player in the Indian social sector.
So it's like a quality stamp.
Exactly.
We've been vetted. We're the real deal.
They're the real deal, exactly. And that stamp of approval can be so valuable. It boosts the NGO's credibility, not just with the government,
Right.
but also with donors, partners, beneficiaries, everybody. Being on DARPAN shows you're transparent, accountable, committed to good governance.
Okay. So I'm starting to get how this benefits both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
But let's get into the specifics. Who exactly needs to register on DARPAN? Is it just any organization that calls itself an NGO?
It's a little more nuanced than that. The regulations are pretty clear. Organizations like trusts, societies, anything set up for charitable or religious purposes, they all need to register.
Right. And just to be clear for our listeners, these categories, those are actually defined within India's Income Tax Act. So we're not just talking about any group that wants to do good deeds, right? There are specific legal structures that fall under this mandate.
Precisely. And it doesn't even stop there. NGOs registered under different acts, like the Societies Registration Act. A lot of nonprofits use that one.
Right.
Or those formed as companies under the Companies Act. Those also need to be on DARPAN. Then you've got different states in India. They might have their own specific legislation.
Right.
That kind of further defines who needs to register. It can get complicated.
So the scope is pretty broad. And then if an organization works with international funding, there's that whole other layer of compliance, right?
Right.
You mentioned the FCRA earlier.
Yes, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA for short.
Right.
That applies to any NGO receiving funds from outside India. It's got its own set of rules and regulations. And DARPAN registration is a key part of showing that you comply with FCRA.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got a pretty good idea of why DARPAN exists and WHO it applies to. Now, let's get practical. Say our listener is running an NGO and realizes, oh, I need to get on this DARPAN platform. What are the actual steps involved?
It's all done online, thankfully. First step is you go to the official DARPAN website.
Okay.
That's n8ledarpan.gov.in. You'll create an account.
Okay.
And then you start filling out the registration form. It's pretty detailed. You'll need to give them information about your organization's mission, objectives, activities, governing body, all that good stuff.
I'm assuming supporting documents are also needed. You can't just say we're a charitable trust and call it a day.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
You need to upload copies of your registration certificate, any trust deeds, bylaws, PAN card.
Mm.
PAN card, that's India's tax ID number,
Right.
other relevant documents.
Right.
Then there's a verification process where the government checks if everything's legit.
And this is where the bank account linking comes in, right?
Yeah.
I remember that being mentioned earlier.
Yes, exactly. It's a crucial step. It's part of that whole transparency initiative.
Hmm.
NGOs have to link their bank account details to their DARPAN profile. This allows for, like, seamless fund transfers.
Right.
Keeps everything accountable on both sides.
It's interesting that they require that. And I get, the need for transparency,
Right.
especially with public funds and all that. But I do wonder if this level of scrutiny might be kind of daunting for smaller, more grassroots organizations. Some might not have the capacity, right, to manage their finances in a way that meets these requirements. Wouldn't that risk excluding some of them from the benefits of being on the platform?
That's a really valid concern, and it's something that's been debated within the sector.
Hmm.
However, the government's stance has been pretty clear. Transparency is key, they say. Having these financial checks in place helps prevent any misuse of funds, make sure those donations are actually reaching the people they're intended for.
Okay, so we've covered the who and the how of DARPAN registration, but now for the why bother. What's in it for the NGOs themselves, besides, avoiding penalties?
Okay. So besides gaining that recognition, the credibility, which we talked about, registered NGOs become eligible for government funding.
Right.
They can tap into various schemes. It's literally the key to a treasure chest of resources.
And we're not just talking about money here. There are also capacity building programs, networking opportunities through DARPAN, right?
Absolutely.
I'd love to dig into that a bit because I feel like that's something that might get overlooked.
Yeah, DARPAN is more than just a regulatory platform, It's
Right.
a hub for learning and collaboration. Registered NGOs get access to all sorts of training workshops, programs organized by the government, covering everything from financial management to project planning, impact assessment, all of it.
So I'm picturing a whole calendar of webinars, workshops, advanced grant writing for social impact,
Exactly.
data-driven storytelling for NGOs, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And beyond those formal training programs, DARPAN helps NGOs connect with each other and with government departments. So you get joint projects, knowledge sharing, even mentorship opportunities.
So it's not just about compliance and funding. It's about, like, building a stronger, more interconnected social sector ecosystem
Right.
in India. That's a pretty compelling proposition, I'd say.
It is. DARPAN is really changing the game for the Indian NGO sector, making it more transparent, accountable, and collaborative, an environment where organizations can thrive and really maximize their impact.
This has been incredibly insightful. So we now understand the what, the why, and the how of DARPAN. But let's explore the impact on the ground, shall we? What are some real-life examples of how this platform has actually made a difference? Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2024, 1130, part 2 of 3.
So we've established kind of the what, why, and how of DARPAN, but I think, it'd be helpful to move beyond the theoretical and talk about, what kind of impact this is having on the ground.
Are there, like, real-world examples you can share about how DARPAN has actually made a difference for NGOs who've, signed up for this?
Yeah, definitely. I came across this story recently about a small NGO in rural Rajasthan. They were doing some really fantastic work on water conservation, but they were really having a hard time getting the funding they needed to expand. They were initially, like, really hesitant to even register with DARPAN.
I can see how that would be intimidating.
Yeah,
Especially for, a smaller grassroots organization
totally.
where they're so focused on that direct action.
Exactly.
And maybe, paperwork and stuff feels like a burden. So what changed their minds?
Well, so they finally went through the registration process.
Okay.
And once they were actually listed on DARPAN,
Yeah.
they discovered there was this government grant specifically for water conservation projects that they had, like, no idea even existed before. But because they were registered
Yeah.
and they had met all the compliance requirements, they were able to apply for this grant. And they actually ended up getting a significant amount of funding,
Wow, that's fantastic.
which allowed them to, really expand their work
Yeah.
and reach way more communities.
That's a perfect example of how, a platform like this can actually help level the playing field
Oh.
and, allow these smaller NGOs to access resources that they might not have even known about.
Absolutely.
It's not just about, the big players. It's about empowering those, those who are really working at the grassroots level. Now, for every success story, I'm sure there are also some cautionary tales. What about instances where organizations haven't complied with DARPAN? Have there been any like significant consequences?
Oh yeah, there have definitely been consequences. There was, I remember this case a few years ago. It involved a pretty well-known NGO that had been receiving like a lot of foreign funding, but they didn't comply with DARPAN's reporting requirements, and
Oh.
they weren't really being transparent about how they were using these funds.
So what happened? Did they just get like a slap on the wrist, or were there like actual repercussions?
It was more than a slap on the wrist, unfortunately. They were flagged during an audit by the government,
Okay.
and they ended up facing penalties under the RBI's KYC guidelines.
Now, I know we mentioned KYC earlier, but I think just for our listeners' sake, it might be good to kind of like remind everyone what that stands for and why it's relevant in this case.
Sure. So KYC, it stands for Know Your Customer,
Right.
and it's basically this set of regulations
Yeah.
designed to prevent things like money laundering
Hmm.
and other financial crimes. It's pretty standard in the financial sector,
Right.
but it also applies to NGOs,
Okay.
especially those that are receiving funds from abroad.
So even though it's focused on, social good and all of that, they're not exempt from these like broader financial regulations.
Exactly. The RBI,
Yeah.
which is India's central bank,
Right.
they require all NGOs to follow these KYC guidelines. It's to ensure that the money is actually being used for legitimate charitable purposes
Right.
and not being diverted for illegal activities.
Makes sense.
In this case, the NGO that wasn't complying, they ended up losing their FCRA registration,
Wow.
which means they could no longer receive any foreign funding.
That's a huge blow.
Yeah.
It really highlights how important it is, not just to, register on DARPAN, but to also understand those regulations
Right.
and, really make sure you're complying, especially when it comes to that financial transparency piece.
Exactly. DARPAN's not just a, box-ticking exercise.
Right.
It's about really embracing this culture of transparency and accountability, showing your donors, your partners, the public,
Yeah.
that you're managing those funds responsibly and actually using them to make a difference.
It seems like DARPAN is playing a pretty vital role in kind of shaping this relationship between NGOs,
Yeah.
donors, and the government in India. We often hear about those tensions that exist
Absolutely.
between those groups, but DARPAN seems to be like fostering a more collaborative approach, wouldn't you say?
It really does. It's creating this platform for dialogue and transparency,
Right.
which really helps to build trust between all those stakeholders.
Mhm.
So instead of having, that kind of suspicion and scrutiny, there's this sense of partnership and mutual respect that's starting to emerge.
Speaking of trust, I want to go back to those KYC guidelines for a moment. Could you maybe like break it down for us?
Okay.
What do those guidelines actually entail for NGOs in terms of, what they actually have to do to comply?
Well, basically, KYC is all about verifying the identity of your donors
Right.
and your beneficiaries, especially those who are, making or receiving significant amounts of money.
Right.
So it involves collecting and verifying documents, things like PAN cards, Aadhaar cards, proof of address.
So kind of like, when you open a bank account or apply for a loan,
Exactly.
you want to make sure you are who you say you are
Precisely.
and there's no, funny business going on.
Yeah, the goal is to prevent things like money laundering, terrorist financing, any kind of illicit activity, basically, by making sure those funds are not going through NGOs for nefarious purposes.
And so this ties back into DARPAN.
Yeah.
Because NGOs need to actually show that they're following these KYC guidelines
Right.
as part of those, compliance requirements.
Exactly. DARPAN requires NGOs to report on their KYC compliance, and they can actually face penalties if they're found to be violating those guidelines.
Okay.
So it's all part of creating that comprehensive ecosystem of transparency and accountability. It's not just about, registering, it's about showing that you're following the rules and upholding those ethical standards.
Yeah. So we've explored kind of the impact that DARPAN is having on individual NGOs. But I'm curious about, maybe zooming out a bit and looking at the bigger picture.
Okay.
Could an initiative like this actually serve as a model for other countries? Yeah, a lot of governments are grappling with, how to regulate
Right.
and support their own NGO sectors. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, we see it all the time, right? Governments are trying to find that balance between regulation and empowerment when it comes to NGOs. And I think DARPAN offers a really unique approach that seems to be striking that balance quite effectively.
I mean, it's fascinating to think about how a platform like this could be, potentially adapted
Yeah.
to different contexts and cultures.
Yeah.
What are some possibilities you see for, either replicating this model or expanding on it, maybe even globally? Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2024-1130, part 3 of 3.
This is where things get really exciting. Imagine a global network, like all these platforms using a standardized format. A donor in the US could easily find an NGO in Kenya, one working on sustainable farming, for example.
Right.
It'd be as easy as ordering takeout.
Wow.
It would revolutionize philanthropy.
I mean, that would be incredible, not just for donors,
Right.
but also think about what it would mean for the NGOs themselves.
Yeah.
They'd have a much wider reach.
Absolutely.
Could connect with partners,
Yeah.
funders they never would have found otherwise.
Exactly. I mean, we could see collaborations,
Yeah.
knowledge sharing on a scale we haven't even imagined yet. An NGO in Brazil learning fundraising techniques from, say, South Korea, or an environmental group in India sharing best practices with, their counterparts in Canada.
The possibilities they're really limitless.
Totally. And it wouldn't just be about sharing knowledge either. Think about the data.
Yeah.
All that information, standardized, globally accessible.
Right.
It'd be a goldmine for researchers, policymakers.
Right.
We could finally get a clear picture of what's working. Identify those global trends, track progress towards those sustainable development goals like we've never been able to before.
That's a crucial point. It's not just about transparency for the sake of transparency.
Exactly.
It's about using that transparency to make better decisions,
Yeah.
improve outcomes, actually make a bigger impact on the things that matter.
Right.
I love this conversation. We started with this platform in India, and now we're talking about a whole global network for social good.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It is. I mean, there would be challenges, of course.
Yeah.
Data privacy concerns, cultural differences, how NGOs operate, cybersecurity, that's huge.
Right.
But the potential benefits, they're too big to ignore. This whole conversation has really renewed my optimism for the future of the whole sector.
Well, folks, we've come to the end of our deep dive into NGO-DARPAN. We've unpacked it, explored its impact, even dreamt a little about its global potential. Hopefully this has sparked your own curiosity, given you a new perspective on how technology can be this powerful force for positive change.
Absolutely. And we always encourage our listeners to, keep exploring. If you're intrigued by initiatives like DARPAN, see what's happening in your own region.
Yeah.
You might be surprised what you find.
As always, keep those conversations going. Share your thoughts with us. Let us know what other deep dives you'd like us to take on. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring,